I've removed all of the timing tools and unlocked the crank, so the timing process is now completely over and done with, which is cool because, you know, that's like kind of one of the last hard things to do, really. And one thing to note is I put a zip tie around that tensioning rail to keep the chain tension. Now, nothing bad will really happen if you let the chain just slack around, but I don't want to risk, you know, it skipping a sprocket or something crazy like that, because who knows what could happen. So I prefer to play it safe and use the zip tie. Anyways, I'm getting ready to put the oil pan, the lower oil pan back on. I cleaned up the pickup screen under the car. It was pretty nasty, filled with aluminum and plastic bits, but that's all clean now, so now we're ready to put the oil pan back on. Now check this out. This is half a can worth of brake cleaner right there. But this is easily the cleanest oil pan in like the tri-state area right now. It's super clean now. It's too bad it's gonna get gross in like 10 minutes of this car running, but oh well. Anyways, I'm gonna stick the new gasket on here, and we're gonna install it, and then I'm going to install the lower stiffening plate, and then I guess we'll go from there. Alright, now we're back up top. The car's back on the ground. So let me tell you what all the things I've done so far. Just, I didn't feel like cataloging each and everything, especially when I was under the X5. It was, clearance was pretty tight, and I was just not having a fun time there. Under the X5, I got the lower oil pan installed and torqued down. Got the lower tensioning cover, the structural and reinforcement cover. It's this big metal cover that holds the sway bars as well, so that needed to be installed again. I torqued down this lower timing cover properly from below and from above, so that's all good. I installed and torqued the power steering pump down there, so that's good to go as well. Okay, so with the lower timing cover torqued down fully, we're going to torque the crank bolt now. Initially you torque it to 100 foot-pounds and use the crank holding tool. You prop it against the subframe, and that's what you use to keep the crank still. So you torque it to 100 foot-pounds, then after that you mark the, you can see the little crude markings I made with a Sharpie. You mark the bolt at around 12 o'clock, you mark the case at 12 o'clock, you mark it at 3 o'clock, and then you subdivide into 2 o'clock, 4 o'clock, and then 5 o'clock. The idea is you turn this bolt 150 degrees, but to visualize it, it's a lot easier to use the clock system. It doesn't have to be super precise, it just has to be in the ballpark and not 180 degrees. You don't want to overdo it. But yeah, so we're going to grab the big breaker bar and the cheater pipe, and we're going to heft that bolt all the way to 150 degrees. And then that'll be it for that. Alright, so the crank bolt is now torqued fully. It wasn't so bad at all. Now for the next step, I'll be installing the alternator, which I don't really need to say too much. It's pretty self-explanatory. It's just a bunch of 10mm bolts and then that main electrical connection there, and that's about it. So I'm going to put that on, and then we're going to move to installing the timing covers, the upper timing covers. That's where it gets kind of interesting, so I'll loop you guys back in for that. Okay, as you can see here, I've installed the upper timing cover here, as well as the alternator down there. Alternator was simple, and for the upper timing cover there's a bit of a trick to get it to align properly, because the thick new gasket prevents it from seating down perfectly. So there's a method where you use the valve cover without the gasket with double the washers on 4 of the studs to force the timing cover into position. The valve cover acts as a bit of a clamp in a way to just clamp it down. So right now what I've done is I've loosely installed this upper timing cover using 4 bolts, very loosely. As you can see, they're still sticking out. They're just barely in there, just threaded in to keep it in position. But once the valve cover is installed with the double washers to anchor it down, I'll be able to torque down the timing cover properly, and I'll show you what that looks like in a sec. Alright, you can see the valve cover installed without the gasket, and that's clamping down the timing cover. As you can see, there are double washers being used up here to provide more clamping force. And also, check out the valve cover. It's pretty sweet. I had it powder coated by a local guy here. Much better than the flaky, nasty old finish that it had. This is still the same valve cover that came off before. It's just way nicer looking now and much more protected from the elements. So yeah, definitely a good investment. It was about 80 bucks to do both. It's this awesome silver vein finish, as it's called. Super nice. Pretty textured too, so it hides like the natural flaws of the valve covers, which is pretty awesome. Anyways, there's the timing cover, fully torqued down now. See, look at how beautifully that aligns up here. This is what really matters, because if the timing cover isn't aligned properly, the camshaft sensors aren't going to read properly and you'll get timing issues. Now that that's installed, we're also going to, since it's the driver's side, we're also going to install new chain tensioners. Here we have the two timing chain tensioners. The old one with 213,000 miles from this X5 is up top, and the newer one, or brand new one, is at the bottom. Note that the spring did not compress that much over the years. That's the design of the spring changed entirely when BMW realized that with the low oil pressure upon a cold startup, for example, the short spring wasn't providing enough tension for the chain, which would let the chain slap around, which ultimately contributed to the demise of the guides. So the spring on the bottom theoretically prolongs the life of the guides. However, if you don't install it, before 100,000 miles, it's completely pointless. But now that I have fresh guides on, I'm installing that, so that'll be pretty cool. Yeah, so I'm going to install that. Okay, so now both timing covers are installed. They're both installed, torqued down. The Vanos solenoids and gaskets are installed on both. I installed the timing chain tensioner on that side. You can't really see it from here, but I installed it there. And now we're getting ready to tackle the valley pan. So as you can see, the valley pan's pretty freaking nasty right now. Note how I put towels into the intakes just to make sure nothing major falls down there. A little bit of dust or dirt won't really hurt, but I just don't want any screws getting down there because that could be really bad with the valves. Anyways, so now we're going to remove the knock sensors, all four of them. Should be pretty easy. And then we're going to remove this plastic cover and then the valley pan itself. Okay, so now we've removed the valley pan gasket and the valley pan cover and the knock sensors, and now you can kind of see the valley pan in all of its glory. It's not too bad at all. I was expecting it to be worse, but I looked at the valley pan and it has a production date of 2010. So this has been replaced before, which is good to know, It shows that this has been, maintained at some point in its 200,000 mile life. Most cars I've worked on have nothing done to them at all. Like the Range Rover I had absolutely nothing done to it in 150,000 miles. So this is a nice change for sure. I was going to vacuum all this coolant out, but it looks like it's the proper BMW blue coolant, and that's what I'll be putting back in. So I don't really see a reason to vacuum that out. So I guess now I'm going to put the new valley pan in, the new cover on. I'm going to clean as much as I can, put the knock sensors back on, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so we've replaced the valley pan gasket and installed the plastic cover, which I cleaned. And we've reinstalled the knock sensors as well, and also at the back, near the back of the coolant manifold, I replaced the one of the hoses, or I removed the old hose that goes to the oil separator, and that came out in pieces, as you can see there. Yeah, it's pretty bad. There are the pieces of the oil separator hose. There's the old oil separator, and then I also installed the new oil separator on there with a new hose. So that should be good. Next step is to install the water pipes and water pump and crank pulley. So I'm going to do that and then we'll catch up. Okay, so now we've got the water pipes, water pump, and crank pulley installed. Now that we have that installed, next step will be to install the valve covers on both sides. Alright, so I've installed the valve covers. As you can see, it looks pretty nice now. Starting to look like a complete engine finally. As I showed you before, the texture of these is pretty freaking awesome. So both of these look pretty good. So with those done, the next step is going to be cleaning up the intake areas and then installing the intake manifold along with all the associated piping in the back. We're pretty much in the home stretch now. After the intake manifold is installed, it's just a matter of installing some water hoses, some belts, some secondary air pipe thing, and hooking up the electrical connectors. So there's really maybe 3-4 hours of work left at this point, so we're finally reaching the end. Okay, it's another day and we have the intake manifold installed. That took about a bit over 2 hours because of all the I had to install the new oil separator in the back. I had to install a bunch of new hoses, and access back there is terrible even with the cabin filter removed. It's just a real hassle to get all that stuff hooked up. So those are all hooked up. The everything at the CCV is hooked up. The fuel line's hooked up. It's all torqued down. So now we can we're pretty much done with the top. Now we're just gotta have to start working on the front. So the next thing I'm going to be doing is installing the secondary air pipe, and then probably the water pump pulley, and then probably the tensioners, the belts, that kind of stuff. So it's starting to get pretty exciting, I'd say. Everything's really coming together. Alright, so since the last update, I've installed quite a few things. First we started with the secondary air pipe thing here. Connected that over there to the pump. Then we installed the water pump pulley. Then I installed the electrical boxes. And then I connected all of the electrical and vacuum connections. There's quite a few of them. I installed the camshaft position sensors on both sides. I installed the ignition coils on both sides as well. I installed spark plugs in a previous step. And yeah, it's looking pretty solid now. This is getting real. Next I'm gonna reinstall the cabin air filter just to get all that finished up, and then I'll be able to take the hood out of service mode. Yeah, and then after that, all that'll be left is to install the cooling hoses and the expansion tank, and then we'll be ready to give this thing a start. Yeah, so I'm not going to install the washer fluid reservoir just yet. I don't really need it yet, so I mean, it's not going to waste time installing it right now. I'll install it later. Alright, so I got a little ahead of myself and I just ended up putting the whole thing back together off camera. It wasn't anything crazy, nothing to really note. Just, reassembling everything, looking at old pictures of mine to see what I took apart. All these vacuum lines, I figured all that out. All the hoses at the back there, all the cooling hoses. I filled the expansion tank with coolant. I bled it a bit. I'm going to bleed it some more after I get the engine running. I replaced the oil filter with a new one. I installed the air intake and the MAF. That's all plugged in. Everything's all plugged in there. That's just the windshield wiper, washer, fluid stuff. I don't need that right now. Coils are installed. Belts are all installed. Everything's installed and ready to go. I think we're about ready to do our first start. I'm terrified.